Hello, thank you for joining today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Matthew. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5. And actually, what we're going to do is review or summarize what we're about to read in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. So if you'd like, you can go ahead and read chapters 5 through 7. We call that the Sermon on the Mount. And so when we get into here, we're going to look at this whole sermon. We're going to break it up into pieces. But I wanted to, before we got into it, I wanted to talk about it a little bit because it is such a famous piece of writing that many people, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, have heard about the Sermon on the Mount. Now, what is the Sermon on the Mount? Well, I'll tell you what it isn't first. It's not a social gospel. It's not telling us that if we do these things, we will become saved. It's not doing that sort of thing. It's telling us how to be, what a disciple of Jesus looks like. That's basically what it's telling us. So, some people look at it and they say, oh, if I do these things, then I know I'm doing the right things. But what Jesus is really kind of trying to show us is that this is what a disciple does. So it's backwards. So as we go through it, I want you to keep that in mind. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is the first of what is called Matthew's 5 discourses. Matthew has 5 sermons in his gospel. We see this one here in chapters 5 through 7. We'll see the next one in chapter 10, a third one in chapter 13, a fourth one in chapter 18, and we'll see the last one in chapters 24 and 25. So those 5 discourses are all the way through the Gospel of Matthew, and they teach different things at different times to his disciples and to others. Now, as we come to this one, the Sermon on the Mount, we'll see that it starts off that there's a crowd of people, and Jesus goes up on the mountain, hence the name, and his disciples follow him up on the mountain. And as he gets up into the mountain and his disciples follow him, he sits down, he begins to preach, and he begins to teach. So we see that basically the audience is going to be, the main audience is going to be his disciples who are with him on the mountain. But there's a secondary audience, which is the crowd. But Jesus is really speaking to his disciples. So that's who it's aimed at. It's aimed at Christians, already existing believers, already existing disciples of Jesus. But it's open to the crowd. And that's how all our church services should be. As we have a church service and the pastor's preaching, it should be to Christians, understanding that there's a crowd or possibly a crowd in the audience that may be listening to what is being said. And that is the way we should be preaching and teaching on Sunday mornings as well, when we get together in our assemblies, following Jesus' model. Now, with that, when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we'll notice that it comes in a good place. He starts it off right here in chapter 5. In chapter 4, we'll remember Jesus starts off his ministry. And as he starts off his ministry, he begins with the statement, repent, the kingdom of heaven is near. And we're going to hear a lot about the kingdom of heaven in this message. So we recognize that Jesus is preaching this message while he's preaching, repent, the kingdom of heaven is near. The other thing we see is that Jesus has just told his disciples to follow me. So this is to his disciples as what it looks like to be a disciple. Finally, the last thing we see in chapter 4, towards the end, is that Jesus was teaching and proclaiming the gospel and healing people. And so what was he teaching? We asked this last time. What was he teaching? Well, now we're going to get an idea of what he was teaching. He was teaching what it looks like to be a disciple. He's teaching what the kingdom of heaven is about. And so that is what we're going to see. Well, as we read the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to recognize that there's some similarities to Luke on the Sermon on the Plain, but we'll also have to be wise and understand that most preachers, Jesus doesn't have a church that he preaches at. He goes around the land. And so most preachers, itinerant preachers, they don't teach something different to each group. They will often teach the same thing to every group because it's important for every group to understand these things. And so Jesus would have preached this message over and over again, but it would have been to different audiences, so he would have tweaked it to mean one thing for one group and one thing for another group, because that's the right way to teach. You don't teach the same thing to everybody. What might be useful for one group of people isn't going to be useful to another. Jesus understands that, so he teaches accordingly. And so while they have a similar subject matter, they actually have different words if you look at it closely. So they're basically talking about the kingdom of heaven, but they're going to use different words to make different points. So while they look similar, they're actually fairly different in many ways. That said, as we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to notice that it's very organized. Matthew has put this together in a very organized way. There's an introduction, which we call the Beatitudes, and some of the things after the Beatitudes, which tell us how do we become a Christian, and how does the world look at Christians, and how do we go into the world. So that's the introduction. Then we have a section from chapter 5, verse 17, all the way through to chapter 7, verse 12, I believe. And that section is the body of the message. It's what Jesus is talking about. And it can be broken down into 4 parts. We'll get into each one of those parts as we go through it. But we can see there'll be 4 distinct parts in the body. And then after that, there's a conclusion. And the conclusion will tell us about the 2 ways. There's always 2 ways. There's the ways of God and the ways of man, or the ways of God, the ways of God and the ways of Satan, the ways of God, the ways of the world. There's always 2 ways, and Jesus shows these 2 ways. And he finally ends with telling us the importance of understanding all that he said in the message and doing those things that he called us to do. So that's basically the Sermon on the Mount. If you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, go ahead and put them in the comment section below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Starting tomorrow, we'll actually get into the beginning, the introduction of the Sermon on the Mount. But thank you so much for joining me today. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you.